once they restarted the brush factory, I got a job back in the brush factory. Amon Get came through there one night, took out his pistol, shot the foreman, started doing something, looking around to see what else he could do. Then he lost interest and left. Just to him, it was nothing. It was just something he just felt like doing it and just left. It was a meaningless thing. There was another time, another one of these officers was walking through the factory where we were working, and I happened to be doing something that putting together two pieces of part of a brush, and it had to be nailed together with brads, and they're little things, and it's hard to drive through hardwood. Anyway, so I was working on that, and this came over there, and she stood next to me, like almost pressing against me, and he said, "If it goes crooked, I'm going to shoot you in the head." At the time, it didn't register with me. I really didn't realize what he had said, and I kept doing it. I kept nailing those things together. He left, and then after the shift was over, and I went back to my barracks and thought about what had happened, that's where I got the shakes. It's just that's kind of life it was, and so. Shinda's people who worked at Shinda's company had to be escorted from the camp now to his factory. And so he was able to persuade the authorities with a bit of bribes to let him build a sub-camp next to the factory so his employees could just, instead of being escorted every day back and forth, they could just get out of the barracks, go to work, and go back to the barracks again without guards because it was right adjacent to the factory. And he was able to accomplish that, as you know, and my father and my brother went to live there. And then once the camp was built, Shinda was hiring more people. Now he had a camp, he had more barracks there, and he had room, and so there was a list of people made up of about 30, kind of mini Schindler's List, of those people who were going to be transferred from the concentration camp Plaszow to Schindler's company, which was considerably better to be in Schindler's company than it was in Plaszow. And so my mother and I were on the list. My father asked Schindler to add my mother and me to the list, and I was on the list, and my mother was on the list, and we were going to be transferred. And a few days before we were going to be transferred, with my good luck or bad luck, I discovered that my name was crossed off the list, and that I was not going to go. And I tried to find out why they did that, or who did it, or what was the reason for it. But nobody paid much attention to me. I was a little kid. They just kind of pushed me off and said, "Never mind, you go back to the brush factory, that's it." And so on the day that they were going to leave, I snuck away from my job in the brush factory and went to see my mother off. I was going to be left alone in this concentration camp. If that had happened, my chances for surviving alone in that camp would have been almost zero. And so I went to see my mother off, and I got closer and closer, and eventually I found myself in front of this Nazi officer who was in charge of escorting the group to Schindler's company. Big guy, monstrous looking, scary. I went up to him, told him my name, and I told him my name was on the list, and somebody crossed my name off. And then I proceeded to tell him about my family. I was talking to a guy who doesn't even think I'm human. I was telling him about my mother is on the list and she's in this group. Then I said my father and my brother are there already. Even then I thought that was a pretty stupid thing to say to a guy like this. But something happened I can't explain. he looked at the list, he looked at me, and he just grunted, like that. Pointed to the group. I jumped in, tried to make myself smaller than I really was. And it seemed like I was there for a long time waiting for the gate to open, but it probably wasn't very long. The group started to move, and I was able to breathe, So I got through the gate and into Schindler's Company. There, once we got to the factory, we were assigned to different jobs, and we were tried out on different locations, different workstations, and they tried me out on a machine that I didn't know too much about it, but I knew where the handles were because my father, I used to watch him work sometimes before the war, and so I could do whatever they showed me to do, one operation. So I did. I ended up working 12-hour shifts in Schindler's Company. Night shift, mostly. But I was too short, so, I was little, and I was not comfortable seeing over the machine and reach the controls better. I used to stand on a box about 8 inches upside down, and I would work there. And Schindler had a habit of course, he entertained a lot. He entertained officials all the time in his office, upstairs from the factory. And once the party was over and the guests left, Schindler would come down all by himself, down to factory floor, and walk through slowly and stop and talk to people. And this is where you could see the difference between a Nazi and a person who did not accept the Nazi ideology. You can imagine he stopped and talked to me and asked me, he'd say good evening, wait for an answer, in complete sentences. He asked me how many pieces I've made, which is probably something he wasn't really interested in knowing, but he just wanted to make a little contact with this kid standing on a box there working this night shift. And sometimes after these visits, when I went to get my ration of food the next day, I would discover that Schindler left word that I should receive 2 rations. It's pretty good. You got to remember. You got to think about this a little bit. A man who partied all night and had all these guests and came down and I guess he didn't have a hangover. He found the person who was handing out the rations of food to tell him to give me 2 rations. That is, it's pretty good. When you judge Oskar Schindler and his activities during that period, you have to judge him within the context of the times then, not within today's times. If he were doing this within today, he would be a pretty good manager, a pretty good CEO, taking care of his employees, and talking to them, visiting them, making sure they knew who he was and he knew who they were. It was just one of those things that you do if you're a good manager. But in those days, the law of the land was to murder Jews. To treat Jews as human beings was against the law and punishable by concentration camp or worse. And so what he was doing was very dangerous to his own well-being. But he did it anyway. And there was no ulterior motive there except that he was a decent human being who was doing the right thing. Once he discovered what the end result was going to be, in the very beginning he had no idea any more than anybody else what the Nazi plan was. But once he realized what the end was going to be, he proceeded to work against it with all that he could.